Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments starting out in the Bakhmut direction, where here the Ukrainian forces have managed to capture Klischiivka. So now they have managed to capture both Klischiivka and Andreevka in succession. They are now pushing southwards in the direction of Kurdyumivka, where they've managed to reach the outskirts of the village of Selenoupilya and Kurdyumivka here to the south. So the Ukrainian forces are currently trying to push the Russian forces by the railways, both to the north, east and south, and all of this while the Russian forces have entrenched themselves within the railways by the forest lines as well as positions by the rail lines. However, the weakness of the Russian forces here is that in most areas this is actually not located by the higher grounds. If we take a look at the topographic map, we can see Andreevka here, Kurdyumivka here to the south and Klischiivka here to the north, and we see that in the northern parts and the eastern parts of the rail lines we see that the locations are actually located at the same height and elevation as Klischiivka, while the Ukrainian forces would now capture areas that are located 50 meters higher than those positions. But further down south to Kurdyumivka and Selenoupilya, we see that they are located at the same height as the Ukrainian positions to the north. So the Ukrainian forces would have a height advantage in the northern parts by Klischiivka and Andreevka, but when they go down south to Kurdyumivka, where the Russian forces actually have a village, the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces would be on the same elevation. This means that in moving eastwards, the Ukrainian forces will not have that much difficulty pushing through the rail lines, as these are located in the low grounds, but once they pass through the rail lines, that is where the Russians have the high ground again. So in these cases, the Ukrainian forces will most likely not look to push eastwards. They may try to push northwards to try and get some effort into Bakhmut itself. Now that they can push northwards in that direction with the capture of Klischiivka, there's essentially nothing holding them back on the eastern parts. Meanwhile, in the southern parts, the Russian forces should be able to hold a stronger defensive position here than in the northern parts, because they'll have the high ground south of Kurdyumivka and the elevated equal parts here by Kurdyumivka itself. During the fighting of Klischiivka, we see that the Russian forces were fighting against the Ukrainians in the high grounds, so the Ukrainians had the advantage here, including the fortifications to the north and west of Klischiivka. We see that the Ukrainian forces had a large advantage as soon as they managed to capture the fortifications. This is why the Russians tried counterattacking but failed due to the effectiveness of the fortifications, and at the same time we see that they tried counterattacking to the east of Klischiivka. However, they were forced to pull back out of the village because of the Ukrainian forces pushing them out, and as such the Russian forces ended up losing their positions to the east and to the north of Klischiivka, and the Ukrainian forces fully captured the village. The current situation in this part of the front line is that the Ukrainians have managed to capture Klischiivka and Andreevka, and as I've said, the Russian forces don't really have any fortifications until the roads here to the south of Bakhmut and then further eastwards by Kodema and so on. Therefore, the Ukrainian forces are now in a better position than they were in previously. With the capture of Klischiivka, they can now start pressuring Bakhmut from the south, as well as pushing more eastwards, cutting off the road, or even pushing southwards, trying to capture Kurdyumivka and Oseria-Nivka. So the Ukrainian forces now have better options here in the south, and according to the latest update by the Institute for the Study of War, the Ukrainian strategy here is to divert Russian forces from Zaporizhia so that they can have a successful offensive by Zaporizhia, and instead have the Russian forces focus their forces here in the defense of Bakhmut. However, we see from the official numbers that the Ukrainians actually outnumber the Russian forces here, which would mean that that is not the case. Why would you divert the enemy forces with more forces yourself? That doesn't make sense. So in the end, it's just the Institute for the Study of War coping with the slow advances of the Ukrainian forces. But as Syriac Maps says in his latest update, the amount of time it takes for one side to capture the villages of the other side through this war isn't an indication as to how strong or powerful the attacking force is, but how much resistance the defending force is putting up. So this means while the Russians took 9 weeks to capture Klischiivka and Andreevka, the Ukrainian forces have spent 3.5 months. Doesn't mean that the Ukrainian forces were any weaker than the Russian forces. It just means that the Russian resistance was that much higher in these areas. We then move on in the southern direction by the Ramelsky Ledge area, where here fighting continues to the east of Vodochine through the positions here in the direction of Novodonetsk, Novomayorsk, and Shevchenkove, but there's been no advances by the Ukrainian forces in these directions. As for the Robotyne area by the Zaporizhia front, we see here that fighting continues here as well in the western and southern directions of Robotyne and in the eastern direction towards Verbove, but again there's been no advances by the Ukrainian forces. As for the latest updates in the direction of Robotyne, the Ukrainian forces were supposedly launching some sort of offensive operation in the direction of Robotyne, and the offensive force was 2 platoons of Ukrainian infantry as well as 2 tanks, after which the tanks were blown up by mines, after which the Ukrainian forces scattered around trying to avoid the upcoming artillery, which then blew their positions as the Ukrainian forces were without armored support. And in relation to the Syriac maps, did a forecast over the remainder of this 4th month or September, and his prediction forecast is very similar to my own, which I did at the start of September, where I said, however, the current situation is that they have only managed to capture Robotyne, and as such, capturing Verbove is a heavy goal for them. Tokmak is now not reasonable. It is not a possibility for them to actually take Tokmak because it is just too far. They have to break through 2 lines of defense, then the Tokmak defenses itself. All of this while stretching in a very thin line. They will not have air superiority, they will not have any of the other things. There is many minefields in this area. It is simply not reasonable. For Syriac maps, what he says is the forecast for the remainder of the 4th month of the offensive remains the same. The Ukrainian army will continue to wear down, making some advances on the southern and Bakhmut fronts, but without achieving the Russian collapse, as happened a year ago in Kherson and Kharkiv. On the other hand, the Russian army will remain on the defensive for some more time. Part of the mobilized troops will continue to gain experience in rearguard training, while rotations will take place from time to time to avoid attrition of the troops at the front. In fact, the Wagner group is expected to return to the Ukrainian fronts, although no longer as a private military company that we knew, but with little autonomy and closely linked to the army, but with soldiers with great combat experience that will allow them to face the Ukrainian attacks. And then we have this from Remilind, who is returning from vacation this Thursday, and he says from his time in vacation, according to unconfirmed reports, the fighters of the Wagner group are returning to the zone of special military operation to work on one of the difficult sections of the front. According to my information, the Wagner group is now working as closely as possible with Rosgvardia. A corresponding agreement has been reached. The fighters of the group have already been notified that the return of the front is not far off. He says he's returning from the vacation on Thursday, but yes, Wagner's return to the front is imminent. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but the Belarusian army has announced that they will do a large-scale military exercise in Belarus at the end of September. According to the information, the following units will be involved in the exercise: the 6th Mechanized Brigade, the 11th Mechanized Brigade, including the 841st Artillery Group and Reconnaissance Battalion, the 19th Mechanized Brigade, including the 191st Artillery Group, the 120th Mechanized Brigade, and the 336th Rocket Artillery Brigade, among others. So this is a significant force and has more than 20,000 soldiers involved. So while the Ukrainian offensive continues, and according to Western articles like this one, the Ukrainian forces are using much more ammunition than what NATO can supply. This has been an issue since the very start of the war. They've mentioned it multiple times because the sheer amount of artillery being used in this war is much higher than what the West were prepared for, and this has created some issues. Much recently, the NATO defense chiefs of multiple countries had a secret meeting in Norway. After the meeting, there was a briefing, and they say that the lack of artillery shells and other ammunition is very difficult right now for the West, both in the sense of it will make it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to defeat Russia due to the lack of weapons, and the fact that they don't have a lot of ammunition makes NATO seem weaker. This creates a issue for NATO because the whole idea of NATO is if they are strong enough, no one will want to fight them or challenge them. But if other countries start seeing that they don't even have ammunition to fight a war, then why is there any reason to hold themselves back? For example, China invading Taiwan is much easier if the United States doesn't have any ammunition compared to if they do. So these ideas may come when NATO is in a state of weakness, which it is when they cannot even supply Ukraine with the ammunition it needs to fight Russia. And if you're wondering if the Russians in turn will run out of ammunition first before NATO does, then according to the latest information, Russia itself provides and produces more ammunition than all of NATO combined, and they have increased their own ammunition production a sevenfold since the start of the war, and they have subsequently reduced the usage of ammunition they are using to a level that is higher than the Ukrainians, but much lower than what they did when they were actually on the offensive. So they're building up their own stockpile, and at the same time there are reports that they're buying millions of shells from North Korea. So you shouldn't just expect that, because most likely the Russians will last much longer than Ukraine will. And with all of this information down, I'll have and leave you guys to it. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.